Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, we are starting our lecture. The Telecom, IT and Internet Committee of Ukrainian Bar Association providing today the lecture that devoted to problem of legal and technological challenges that we have from cybersecurity, cyber warfare. And here with us, our guests were very highly appreciated for you. It's Ian Whitehurst, it's a barrister, having a 37, if I'm not mistaken. Ian has more than 25 years experience at the bar, specialized in very specific and complicated crimes, and as well as cybersecurity, cyber crimes too. Yeah. The second, our speaker, Mark Potkovitz, is an American attorney, and he is a former director of the Legal Innovation Center, also has an academical experience, and Mark specialized in utilise system and artificial intellect system, And the third our speaker is Steve Funnell, is a professor of cyber security of the University of Nottingham. Also you has academical, as I said, experience, in field and specialized in cybersecurity and cyber crimes. Dear guests, let's talk our lecture. Would you please start?
Of course.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. My name's Ian Whitehurst. I'm a barrister, as you've been told, at Guernica 37 Chambers. I'm also an arbitrator and also an honorary associate professor. What we're going to talk today about is, in effect, combating cyber warfare, which is particularly relevant to your country at the present moment in time, but is also going to be relevant to a lot more countries as the century develops. And what we want to do during the currency of this lecture is, in effect, to engage in a conversation between myself, Professor Funnell, and Mark, talking about the issues, both legal and technological, which in effect can be improved to protect states against cyber warfare, cyber espionage, and organized crime attacks on various infrastructures. So really the purpose of today is to give you our thinking about how legal and technological issues can be improved, not only in the Ukraine, but also generally on an international basis. Now, with that, in effect, general introduction and purpose behind the lecture that we're giving today, I'd like to, in effect, invite Mark to identify what he sees as some of the major challenges posed to governments and also to justice systems in the various countries of Europe and worldwide, and how those challenges could be, in effect, addressed by lawmakers, judges, and lawyers themselves. Mark, what are your views on the big challenges facing governments at the moment from cyber warfare and cyber espionage?
Well, thanks, Ian. I appreciate your starting out with an easy question for me to answer. Obviously, this is a very big challenge. We know that law tends to be retrospective, very backwards looking. And so lawmakers tend to address issues once they have been identified because something has happened. We know that from an international law perspective, customary international law and the rules of armed conflict go back centuries. But when it comes to what is no longer a burgeoning cyber domain, we do not yet have the legal infrastructure to catch up with what both state and non-state actors are doing. War historically has typically been, as you all know, between contiguous states more often than not, and then might have skirmishes in the oceans overseas. It wasn't really until later on in the 19th century, in the 20th century, of course, that you started to have more international conflict with respect to issues not related to sovereign territory. So when it comes to the cyber domain, we have a lot of challenges with respect to the notions of when a cyber interference or a cyber event crosses the threshold into something that could be considered an act of war. We all know that there have been large-scale data breaches in the past, things in the United States, for instance, like Operation Titan Rain, as it's been called. Some of us might be familiar with the Conficker worm that infected tens of thousands of computers worldwide. There's also the Stuxnet virus, which was used in a case of physical espionage. And so now, while we consider the fact that we no longer need a statewide infrastructure in order to produce digital weapons of mass destruction, we see a lot of legislators, lawmakers, and judicial systems struggling to understand how best to confront the issues regarding the cyber domain. I know that this is more Professor Furnell's area as a professor of cybersecurity than mine as a lawyer. So I'll quickly wrap up by saying that the challenges are legion with respect to how to address this. And without a customary international law approach that is adopted by a critical mass of countries, I'm skeptical that we can produce a framework that can adequately address the threat of both state and non-state actors with respect to the domain of cyber.
Thanks, Mark. Over to you, Steve, if you can give your view from a cybersecurity perspective.
Yeah, so thanks, folks. And well, yeah, Steve Furnell here from University of Nottingham, and also a board member of something called the Chartered Institute of Information Security, which is a UK professional body in the area. Now picking up what Mark said, he's already sort of flagged the scale of some of the breaches that we've seen. And I think part of the challenge here is also the breadth of the problem. And again, he alluded to this, that we need to address in order to prevent those breaches taking place. So we've got a whole range of technologies that are now being utilised, adopted by organisations, and in some cases, okay, they've got the technical capability to understand what they're taking on board. But in other cases, particularly when we think about medium-sized and smaller organisations who nonetheless are part of the overall supply chain, in some cases, they are, in a sense, struggling to understand the basics of the technology itself, let alone the challenge of how to properly secure it. And we've got various issues on the technical side of security, so from the devices to the network communications and to the safeguarding of the data, but also the sort of the wider dimensions of the organizational policies and the people that are involved. So when we start to think of the breadth of what cybersecurity actually means and the number of issues that you've got to take on board to try to address it adequately, then it's a significant challenge in itself, alongside, of course, using the technology for the purpose that you've actually introduced and adopted it for, in terms of the business, the organizational objectives you're trying to achieve. So it's, as Mark basically said, the challenges there are legion. It's no small undertaking to try and get this right.
Would you say, Steve, that especially in Europe, to concentrate on that for the present purposes, do you think that the existing cybersecurity structures deployed in the public and the private sector are presently fit for purpose for combating cyber warfare, cyber espionage, or financial espionage, in effect?
So I think the answer ultimately is it's pretty varied. I mean, there's certainly some standards and guidelines out there that organizations can use as a reference point and can follow. And if these are fully adopted, then organizations are placing themselves in a fairly good position. I think the challenge is, and if you look at the results of there are surveys and studies that you see, the practical picture is by no means sort of homogenous in this respect. And there are some organizations that are, they've got some of the foundational elements in place. In other cases, not necessarily even that. You're looking at, for example, the Cybersecurity Breaches Survey in the UK, which is conducted annually for our Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. You look at the results from that in terms of the use of different types of safeguards, and things such as, so let's say network security, sort of fairly prominent if you look at the overall percentage of organizations that are doing something. But if you dig under the surface, then it's a bit more varied there. And then you look at, okay, the extent to which organizations feel they've got things like appropriate software updating, if like patch management in place, processes around incident response. Again, it's not telling the same picture. And if you've not got attention to all of these different aspects, then there's a level of vulnerability that you're going to be exposed to. So if you're not keeping systems up to date, then that gives a an increased window of vulnerability, potential for exploitation of the systems. That gives you the need to actually be able to deal with it and have incident response processes in place. And so if you've not got all the bases covered off, you're leaving yourself exposed. So I say that there's guidance there are standards that organizations could follow, there's actual standards, there's less formal sort of guidance as well, but the extent to which it's adopted and the extent to which organizations are perhaps positioned to do it, again, to be able to enact the advice, you need appropriate expertise in-house. And if we look at the picture internationally, for many years it's established there's a global shortage of cybersecurity practitioners. And so if you're in the position that you've not got the capability in-house and you've not necessarily got the capability to get it from elsewhere, then again, you're potentially exposed as a result. And yeah, for larger organizations, those operating in the recognized critical national infrastructure space, there's going to be obviously more attention from their perspective and more expectation, more legislative requirement for them and regulatory requirement for them to have got it right. But then there's organizations sort of further down the line, let's say in their supply chain, that could also prove the points of vulnerability for those organizations to face an exposure.
I think what we can say from what you're saying, Steve, in effect, is that the approach to cybersecurity is going to have to be at the forefront of most national governments' planning, both internally and externally, in relation to their relationships with other states, just as much as, shall we say, traditional defence spending or traditional defence tactics are being deployed by them at the moment. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it needs to be recognised. I think it is increasingly recognised as a front on which we need to make sure we've got the appropriate pieces in place. So if you look at something like the Network and Information Security Directive from the EU, the existing version of that talks about the need to have appropriate recognition within the EU member states to have a body that can act as a response point, and also for organizations to have this associated culture of security. I think the difficulty there is understanding what that third one actually looks like in practice, and how can an organization demonstrate that it's got that mindset, that it's got the necessary pieces in place to address it.
Turning to Ukraine specifically, which, as we've seen in the West, there's been a large amount of reporting about the sophistication of the Ukrainian approach to not only cyber warfare, but cyber espionage. In effect, what further skills what further lessons do you think the Ukraine can learn from the matters which they've been dealing with very successfully so far going forward? I'd like Steve's view first, and then also Mark's, if we may. Well,
I think it is that thing of actually recognizing that this is a front on which the challenge needs to be faced, developing those skills to be able to deal with the issues that are being faced there, to be proactive in recognizing where the areas of exploitation are likely to be and why things are likely to be targeted, and monitoring and being able to respond rapidly on those fronts. I think those are key elements of this. So in a sense, that risk assessment, realizing that this is something that now is a valuable asset overall, or it's the key to enabling valuable and necessary activities to continue. Therefore, it's going to be a point of exposure or potential exposure, certainly a point of interest for somebody to try to attack it in order to compromise and have an effect through that. So that upfront recognition and playing out those scenarios, recognizing the risks and what the consequences would be if that was to be exploited.
Thanks, Steve. Mark, have you got any views or perspectives upon this issue?
Well, certainly it seems to me that information sharing can be crucial in these types of times. One of the issues, for instance, we face in the United States is that most of the internet infrastructure and a lot of the other types of critical infrastructure are privately owned, not necessarily publicly owned. So I can say that the US can face challenges with respect to sort of combating cyber incursions because it doesn't have visibility into what goes on the private infrastructure that supplies the plumbing and piping, so to speak, of the internet. So I can say that one of the things the US is trying to do is create a better framework to have visibility into what the critical infrastructure, what is happening with the critical infrastructure. So I certainly imagine that information sharing so that different domains can be aware of the types of attempts to breach or breaches that might be occurring so that they can be mitigated across different systems is important.
Thanks for that. Now, I'd like to just change the emphasis of the lecture a little bit now. We've talked about the challenges and also the technological challenges and improvements which can be, shall we say, developed in addressing this new and continuing threat of cyber warfare / espionage. What I want to talk about now really in some respects is some of the legal challenges in effect which lawyers will face combating this area of law, so to speak, this public international or public international criminal law in effect. And from my own perspective, one of the difficulties I foresee, first of all, is obviously the cross-jurisdictional nature of cyber warfare and cyber espionage. And in effect, a security expert may be able to identify and locate where an attack has come from, but the difficulty which we all going to have is trying to bring those individuals to justice and to hold them to account for what they have done, either in relation to national secrets or infrastructure, or in effect attacking, shall we say, weaponized sites by derailing various weapon systems. And I think cross-jurisdictional issues is going to be one of the big fundamental problems which at present we face in relation to combating cyber warfare. And it's linked to an issue we'll develop further about, in effect, an absence of international norms. And I think Mark touched upon that already. Mark, what do you see as probably the best way to try to combat and try to make effective the investigation and prosecution of cyber warfare going forward?
You know, it's incredibly difficult. As we've all sort of touched on, a lack of international norms for how to address these types of matters creates sort of a lot of cases of first impression, and courts don't necessarily like cases of first impression. You know, the idea was that at a certain point in time, if you were to, for instance, rob a bank in Paris, you would need to be in Paris to rob the bank. Now, you don't need to be in Paris to rob the bank. You could be in the United States to rob a Parisian bank and transfer the money to Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. And so whenever you have anything of this type of nature, where jurisdiction is a challenge, where it's unclear what law attaches, and because you have the person committing the act in one jurisdiction, you have the territory affected in a completely different jurisdiction, the lex loci approach to international law might not necessarily be as applicable, or at least we don't have a framework to suggest how that would work. And even if we do make that attribution in the case of cyber criminality or cyber warfare, the lack of norms makes it challenging to determine what the appropriate action is. So, for instance, if you were to have a hostile nation take over a server farm in a country unaffected by a particular conflict, let's say in this instance, Sweden has a server farm that is hijacked by a hostile nation, and then that Swedish server farm is used to launch a distributed denial of service or a DDoS attack on another nation. Is Sweden somehow co-belligerent in that instance? Most of us would probably agree that Sweden isn't, but what if the nation being attacked sends a démarche to Sweden saying, you know, you have this server farm, we've attributed the attacks back to this physical IP address in the world, and we need you to shut it down. For some reason, don't know why I'm picking on Sweden, but they have a domestic law that says, no, we can't just shut down these server farms. Then at what point do they become a co-belligerent state? And that's something that really hasn't been contemplated. The earliest attempt to sort of put an international framework across the cyber domain was the Tallinn Manual in 2013. And this was in response to a handful of things that happened in what people sort of call the first instance of cyber warfare, perhaps, which was a bunch of attacks launched against Estonia in the late 2000s in response to sort of the removal of a statue. The NATO Center of Excellence put together all these academics and folks in the military got together and put together this big book called the Tallinn Manual in 2013. And then they quickly realized that they needed to update it. So I think it was 2016 or 2017, they released Tallinn 2. And the big difference between Tallinn 1 and Tallinn 2 was that Tallinn 2 addressed peacetime cyber activities, as well as actions by non-state actors. So even the first major attempt to try to in a sense, codify norms for a customary international law with respect to cyber fell short because it didn't really look at the whole picture. And we see that it is a heavily evolving landscape. And I'm sort of wandering off topic a little bit. So I'll sort of loop myself back in to say that a lot of these things are very difficult for us to sort of wrap our heads around from a legal perspective. And when we begin to have these investigations, when we begin to hold people and nations to account, I think that some of the traditional rules of armed conflict will be contemplated. And with respect to non-state actors, I do think that even if they get involved in sort of sovereign level espionage, I think that we'll see them treated the same way that pirates were treated. That will look to transportation and maritime law and customary international norms to sort of hostess humani generis, enemies of all mankind, and sort of that framework with respect to how we deal with these kinds of things. So sorry for the long answer.
No, that's fine. And before I talk to Steve about the cybersecurity angle about how this can be combated, I think going back to your original example of the Paris bank being robbed, nowadays, if the Paris bank is robbed by individuals in the Cayman Islands who move the money to Switzerland, if in effect the money is big enough, then you will see cooperation between states in relation to that kind of private criminal acts. I think the big difficulty we have here, and the big elephant in the room in relation to this aspect of cyber warfare, is the political will to combat it, and also the political cooperation. Because in effect, as we've seen in international crime generally, there are various systems in place. You mentioned Tallinn, but also more importantly, there's the International Criminal Court. But that does fall down on a variety of factors. And I can see the difficulty here in enforcing a cross-jurisdictional cyber warfare approach is going to be generating the political will. And I think one of the factors which the Ukraine can probably lead the way here is they've lived it, they've experienced it, and they are going to be able to lobby, in effect, I hope, and will do in due course, for the creation of an international cybercrime approach, because they know what the drastic consequences that they have. The people who signed up for the lecture today are not being able to view this in real time because the electricity's been cut as an attack by the Russian state upon, shall we say, general infrastructure. So I think the key thing from my view as a lawyer, strangely enough, is to get the politics right. And I think that's going to be the most important challenge for lawyers, is to ensure the politicians take the lead. Would you agree, Mark, before I turn over to Steve?
Well, absolutely. And just to draw a parallel to something that you've just sort of elucidated, if a missile, some projectile or some other explosive device were to take out a power plant, were to knock a critical infrastructure offline, that would certainly be an act of war. That is traditional casus belli, and that the nation is justified under the rules of armed conflict to respond with a similar kinetic attack. But if a cyber attack were to knock a power plant offline, for instance, under the current framework, that might not necessarily be considered an act of war in the same way that a kinetic attack that achieved the same result would be. And that's very strange to me. The fact that if a country invades another country's sovereign territory, classic act of war, nobody questions that. But if a country were to invade a country's sovereign digital space, hack a government ministry, for instance, or a Department of Defense and exfiltrate information, that wouldn't necessarily be considered an act of war traditionally, as it would if they were physically in the presence of the jurisdiction. So I just, I don't really have an answer to that. I don't really understand why that's the case. But it certainly is strange to me that, as you've identified, the politics haven't caught up with the current world in which we live with respect to these issues.
Just on that point, before I turn to Steve, I agree with you there. And I think one of the big issues is the uncertainty surrounding international cyber generally is leading to people, whether it's either rogue states, professional organized criminals, or even, shall we say, states who are not rogue but are well known for their actions. That uncertainty has bred an ability for them to break the rules or push the rules to as far as possible, and only by, in effect, in my view, getting a clear line of engagement, a clear line of clear set of international norms and procedures, will there be, in effect, the fear or the draconian consequences imposed by those systems to stop this type of activity. And I think that's what we really need. Now, I've said Steve twice, I'm going to turn to Steve now. We're talking about legal issues here, about the cross-jurisdictional nature of enforcing and detecting and combating cybercrime. Steve, from a cybersecurity perspective, every nation state is obviously interested in, shall we say, their own protection. But equally, I think the last 9 months or so have demonstrated that, in effect, that we all, in some respects, stand together in Western Europe at the very least, and in the civilized world. What do you think cybersecurity professionals from other countries can bring to the debate on this cross-jurisdictional issue and how to combat it and how to address it?
Well, I think, as Mark mentioned, I mean, the whole thing of information sharing, sharing of intelligence on the types of attacks that are being seen, the types of safeguards that would be therefore suitable to help address them, combat things, that's important, and there's elements of that are there. So the information sharing frameworks, etc. I think, to a degree, though, or to a significant degree, I'd go back to the challenge, the real challenge being the legal and the political dimension to it, more than the knowing what to do. So in a sense, the nature of what the cybersecurity ought to look like in terms of the protective, defensive technologies and the processes to follow in response, what you can do around incident response and recovery. There are things there. There are internationally agreed standards. You've got things like ISO 27002 controls for cyber information, cyber security. There are things that organizations can put in place. The challenge is more the issue, as you say, of how to get the cross-jurisdictional agreement on what to do when an attack is taking place from one place to another. This isn't to say that there are no challenges in getting that cybersecurity position in place, because as I've mentioned before, there are non-trivial skills involved to take an organization to a point where it's putting it crudely, able to tick the box to say that it's got certain defenses in place and to recognize the breadth of what they need to do. But even with those things in place, it's almost by definition still going to be imperfect. There will be new developments in the attack space, and this is I suppose another element of the challenge on the protection side, that the technology changes, the nature of the attacks evolve as well. It's by no means static. So we know the basic principles of what we need to protect, but the realities of the exact technologies that would be relevant to achieve the same level of protection next year as we would use to achieve it this year will need to evolve. So the security, the provision of the security is a never-ending process as well. It's never a situation, okay, we put some controls in place, we're now done. We've got to monitor that. We've got to maintain the effectiveness of the safeguards. Things that are nothing directly to do with the security, so the applications, the platforms, the systems that we use, new vulnerabilities get discovered within those. It relies on people updating the platforms they're running things on, otherwise they're exposed. So all of this is an evolving picture that organizations need to keep up with. And I say, in order to do that, they need the underlying skills to support it. So it's an ongoing challenge in that respect, but I think it's that little bit more straightforward than the legal and political landscape that then enables the responses at that level to be taken.
Thank you, Steve. Now, I've got a question for both of you, if I could pose this one, and using it by analogy, really. We all are aware that NATO, it's one of NATO's core principles, is in fact, if one of their states' territories is invaded, that is an attack upon the whole of the NATO structure, and in effect would justify, shall we say, armed conflict in self-defense. Do you foresee the possibility for NATO expanding that principle in due course and to cover, in effect, the cyber territory of each state, or the cyber sphere of each state, being, in effect, protected and underneath the umbrella of NATO? And secondly, if it was, how could that practically be enforced? The second part, probably for you, Steve, the practical consequences of NATO trying to implement a policy of this. Is it feasible? Bearing in mind we have institutions, organizations like Five Eyes, so to speak, involving certain Western states. But before we turn to the practical possibilities of NATO doing that, Mark, what are your views about, from a legal and political sense, NATO expanding their remit to include the cybersphere as part of the territory of a state?
I think it's so difficult to sort of. I think that we will maybe see a shift that does contemplate certain sort of principles that might include cyber. The problem is, let's just say, arguendo, NATO were to announce, oh, by the way, if the following 5 things are done from a cyber perspective, we'll consider that, activation, a cause to activate, the mutual defense sort of components. Well, then what you would do is have, state actors stop just shy of what the announced threshold would be that would warrant activation of the activity. So then the problem is that you would probably need to see it broadly announced in certain types of vague principles. That being said, once that happens, politics then comes into play, and political expediency will sort of begin to rule the day. It's also so challenging in that issues of attribution. So, and I'm so sorry to keep going back to the same type of example, but if you were to have a missile launch, right, or a sort of a plane that's a kind of bomber or something like that, you would be able to see where the missile launched from. You would be able to see where the plane took off from, or if not where it took off from, you would be able to reasonably determine by the nature of the types of technology involved, which countries were likely to do it. You know the range of the plane, you would be able to say where it likely took off from, and be able to kind of reverse engineer the incident to determine who is responsible. When it comes to cyber, it's not always the case. And I'll let, Steve, when we turn to him, maybe you could comment on how well attribution, how confident we are with certain types of attribution. But it seems to me a sophisticated, advanced, persistent threat or state actor could commit an act and make it seem like it came from another jurisdiction completely. So then the question becomes, what sort of cyber event warrants or justifies a kinetic response? And the answer is, I don't know. So are we going to see a cyber attack on a NATO country so that other NATO countries launch a cyber attack on the perceived initiator of the first attack? It's hard for me to say, but I do believe that you will begin to see a delineation where certain critical infrastructure components, whether it's hospitals, whether it's utilities, electricity, gas, power, that certain types of things that would have a significant impact on a country's function might necessarily be considered within those sort of items that are sort of sacrosanct. I mean, it seems to me if somebody were to bring down a website through a distributed denial of service attack, does that warrant a threshold of activating a treaty? Well, no. I mean, it seems unlikely that would be the case. But what if there's a huge data breach, that compromises personal health information of a large number of people, other personal financial information of a number of people? That becomes to me a more difficult issue. If electric lights, if a power plant in a small town is knocked offline, but nobody is really hurt, is that the same as knocking off a New York City, a Paris, a London offline? I do believe that we will begin to see certain things as sort of, maybe in the same way that we have chemical weapons bans that are, from a normative perspective, accepted by most countries. And those countries that do engage in that type of activity or threaten it are harshly sanctioned. It seems to me maybe certain types of cyber activities might get added to that list, where just certain types of targets are considered, non-starters. But I'm not sure.
Thanks, Mark.
Steve, I've got a comment. Sorry.
Of course. Yeah.
Would you please let me? Yeah, I do agree with you, Mark. But sometimes we don't know from which territory was cyber attack. But for example, yesterday I read information about a lot of cyber attacks Ukraine has in this year. And I know that Ukrainian cyber protectors, they prevented the cyber attack that may involve blackout in Ukraine in April this year. And they identified that it was the same group of Russian military hackers that made blackout in Ukraine in 2015 and 2016. In this case, we will know who done it. Yeah, and unfortunately, we have nothing to do with it. Yeah, we have no mechanism to do it. Yeah,
I think it's a very good point. It's you can identify, you can know who they are, but at the moment in time, there's no sanction against these people, not only against the state, but those individuals. And perhaps in some respects, the sanctions applied on Russia as a whole, which was concentrated principally on billionaires and shall we say, acolytes of Mr. Putin, may well have to also start to be imposed in relation to individuals involved in the cyber industry. I think it's going to call for a more nuanced approach in the short term, but hopefully on a later stage, states will start to see the importance and the significance of this, because going back to what's happening in the Ukraine now, and Mark's examples, what happens if they take down a nuclear power plant, which then, God forbid, goes into meltdown? Or you take a hospital offline and 70 patients in critical care die. I mean, those are very serious consequences, which I think, in effect, the Ukraine are living with, but the West generally are going to have to start seriously addressing. And it's a point I think I'll talk about later, about the critical point that Ukraine and other states are in relation to their interface with, shall we say, rogue states, and they need the support, which hopefully the West will eventually realize they need, because also it affects them in the long term. And that's part of the politics, though. I think that's one of the difficulties we have at the moment. Sorry to interject, Steve, if you could give us your perspective on, shall we say, the security challenges and the security approaches on a more NATO-wide, to use that body as an example, approach to protecting individual states. What challenges would be faced, in effect?
Well, I mean, one thing I seem to begin all my little bits by just sort of referring back to Mark and agreeing with what he said, but I would second that point about the attribution of things that have taken place, because the very nature of the cyber attack aspect of things makes it more straightforward for people to obfuscate where they are coming from, to use the style of attack that's associated with other groups, so to make it look like somebody else on the surface is responsible. So, from origin to techniques used, there's ways of making it look like somebody else is the root cause. So there's that fundamental first challenge of actually needing to be sure, okay, is it what it looks like, and is it being made to look like something it isn't? So that that underpins provides the difficult foundation then for taking a response. And I suppose, again, going back to that issue of, well, okay, how does NATO and sort of organizations even more generally put themselves in a position where they're able to take response actions, to provide protection, to play their role in this space in the same way they do in the physical world? It again comes down to that capability issue. So it's having to cultivate that alongside not losing the capabilities that they've got in the physical context, building up, and we're seeing elements of this occurring, building up the capability base on the cyber side, so that becomes an element of what's understood, understanding the overlaps between the cyber and the physical elements, and having the keeping up capability in terms of the cyber techniques that the aggressors, the attackers, whatever we want to call them, are at the forefront of developing. And in some cases we see techniques that the defense side have developed as a means of sort of, I suppose, proactive defense, shall we say, then being utilized to attack, coming back and attacking them. So the whole space is another of those where it's dynamic, and it's keeping up with the development in this context. So just another dimension of the challenge, basically.
That's great. So before we move on to, sorry, Mark, go on.
Oh no, I was going to, I think this attribution piece that we've hit on too is going to be crucial. In some circumstances, it'll be very obvious who there isn't a question based on circumstances who the bad actor is. But there are certainly some where you could see some countries trying to embroil other countries in conflict where, it's mimicry. It's done specifically just to create conflict for a sort of nations that wouldn't necessarily be in conflict with one another. So I think it's going to be very sticky.
Well, before you move on to the final section, in effect, about proposed solutions, although we've talked about some of them during the currency of this debate, I've got an example came to my mind, Mark, from a legal perspective. I'd like your view, and I'm sorry to drop this on you now. But say, for example, going back to the attribution point, say that a state is attacked, and it's a very serious cyber attack. In effect, the healthcare system is taken offline for 7 days. So it has a major impact upon society. They they attribute the attack with all clarity on a certain group of individuals. Do you think that there will come a time where states will feel justified in responding to a cyber attack by actually a kinetic armed attack on individuals, in fact, taking them out, so to speak, in their activities? And secondly, do you think there's a potential where we could be in a situation where certain rogue individuals or rogue states and individuals they're using to commit these offences would be renditioned, or is it legally possible for them to be renditioned back to the state where the acts were committed upon? I say that to an American because Americans have quite a bit of experience with rendition, shall you say. But what do you think about that scenario? Do you think a state would ever be justified, in effect, in invading another state to take out criminals and to bring them to justice within the original state?
So, yeah, this is obviously an issue that following the terrorist attacks in the United States on September 11th, 2001, the United States, as a matter of national policy, began to do things that a lot of the rest of the world looked at and said, these are violations of customary international law and violations of norms, and sort of underscored that from a normative perspective, powerful countries will do what they can get away with. So when it comes to this example that you said of a hypothetical group of non-state actors, sort of, well, just to complete the analogy, call them cyber terrorists, because if we think that they're attacking civilian targets, you know, depending on the sort of international norm of terrorism, arguably that could be considered terrorism. So if we just say they're cyber terrorists, to give them a term, you know, do I see a country beginning to sort of treat them in the same way the United States treated groups it identified as terrorist post 9/11? And if the country has the resources to do those kinds of things, I wouldn't be surprised to learn of a country beginning to do those kinds of things. I don't think the international community would be very fond of the idea of a country, you know, going after hackers from sort of a military type process and rendering them. But I do think that we are going to see, in the same way that pirates sort of were targets for universal jurisdiction with respect to the types of crimes they committed. We saw this with torture and extrajudicial killing with the United Nations Convention Against Torture in the 1980s. I wouldn't be surprised if soon we begin to identify certain types of cyber attacks as sort of cyber crimes against humanity. And it seems to me that the willful targeting of civilians, the willful targeting of civilian infrastructure, leading to, with the intent of causing civilian harm and civilian death, could very likely be considered a crime against humanity. And once we have that framework where, if we, from a normative perspective, and I keep using that phrase because again, it's what the countries are willing to do or engage in, if we identify certain types of cyber activity as sort of this harmful cyber terrorism, let's say, and that if the people who commit these acts are cyber terrorists, then there's a familiar framework, as you've identified, that the United States has used in the past that will be adopted in order to deal with that. Now, do I think we're going to see drone strikes of cyber hackers who are causing this disruption? I don't think that's very likely from a US perspective, but would I see the idea of countries beginning to get diplomatic pressure from routinely hosting hacker groups that do commit these activities? I think yes. There's a sort of an analogy that's the arsonist, you know, the person who sets fires in the basement. You own a property, you rent the basement to a tenant, and then all of a sudden fires begin in your neighborhood. You're not under any ethical or moral obligation to report the person in your basement, your tenant, if you don't have constructive knowledge of the fact that they're setting these fires. If eventually you do learn that you are hosting somebody in your property who is causing damage, you know, the question becomes, at what point does your not turning that person into the authorities make you complicit in their crimes, especially if someone becomes harmed? So if you are a nation state that is host to these non-state actors who are an advanced persistent threat or who are committing these acts targeting civilians, and we are able to attribute over and over again that these hackers are operating in the sovereign territory of, country X, I do think that country X will face a large amount of diplomatic pressure to arrest and extradite them.
Thanks, Mark. Now, sorry to throw that curveball at you, but I just thought it popped into my head and I thought, well, why not? Now, if I can come to the concluding part of this lecture, if we may, and can I start with Steve? Steve, imagine for one moment that you are Supreme Cyber Commander in charge of security for the whole of Europe, in effect. What 3 proposals or reforms would you introduce which would increase the cybersecurity of nation states?
Oh, just give me a simple one to do there, Ian. Yeah. So I suppose one thing would be to have if I could wave the magic wand, a more harmonized level of actual protection that organizations are able to put in place. The next would be to ensure that when incidents are occurring, that there's a known and established means for the organizations to respond in and of themselves, but also that intelligence sharing, the data sharing and communication within the wider community to ensure that others are protected. And on the side of the third one, it's that ensuring that you've got the sustainability of the approach. So if I get my magic wand, I'm going to sort of establish a stronger pipeline of skills coming through so that organizations that need the support have got the ready places that they can find it.
That's great. Thank you for that, Supreme Commander. Turning now to Mark. You're a lawyer, you're an academic, you've also been a lobbyist back in the day. From a political perspective, what do you think could be, in effect, the major proposals from a political level which could improve cybersecurity and to protect people from cyber warfare around, in effect, the world?
Well, I do think that international norms, whether it's some kind of treaty that requires sovereign states to adopt their own domestic laws to conform to the treaty terms, is probably the most effective. We've seen in the past international treaties signed that do not require execution in domestic legislation, and those tend not to have as much teeth because there needs to be an international appetite in order to pursue these things. So, for instance, with the Convention Against Torture, one of the codicils was that member states needed to pass domestic laws that created harsher sanctions and civil penalties, for instance, in some circumstances for victims. So not only do I think we need an international legal framework here, I think we also, in other jurisdictions, might need some kind of international civil legal framework. Sorry, I keep going back to this instance of torture because it's something I was involved in a case where we were suing a head of state for torture and extrajudicial killing. So it happens to be something that I just have rolling around in my head. But for an instance, the United States has something called the Torture Victim Protection Act, which allows for civil litigation against people who subject other individuals to torture or extrajudicial killing, even if the act wasn't committed inside the United States. And so not only does this allow for sort of a greater deterrent in this activity, because if you don't have the appetite on a state level to pursue people who commit these kinds of offenses, there's certainly an ability for victims to bring private claims against them, which wouldn't necessarily bring them to justice in the criminal sense, but could allow for them certainly inflicting some financial pain on the people who commit these acts and allow for some form of restitution, in a sense, through the courts, even if it's a resident of a different jurisdiction who does have international bank accounts. The treaties that enforce judgments could allow seizure of assets in foreign banks, for instance, if a judgment is made as a default. So in short, and I apologize for not keeping it shorter, but international treaties and norms that would allow for universal jurisdiction for the capture and trial of people who commit these acts, independent of where the acts were committed, and potential component civil litigation that would allow for people who have been harmed directly to bring claims against the people who commit these acts.
On that point about civil claims against individuals, in effect, who've committed torture, for example. Now, speaking now as a criminal lawyer, in my experience over 25 years, with criminals, whether they are bank robbers of French banks, whether they are drug dealers from South America, or whether they're warlords, or whether they are dictators. Follow the money is what was said about the Nixon administration. And if you follow the money and you take their money, they find that exceptionally painful and very disruptive of their activities. And my view has always been, in some respects, that if you can't prosecute an individual, then you take the money off him and make him squeal. And that approach in America, in effect, and that legislation probably reflects my experiences over the last 25 years dealing with major criminals, whether it's domestic or international. So I think it's a very interesting point. And it may well be something which, I'm not aware of the Ukrainian civil code, but it may be something which the Ukraine and other states, in effect, who are at the forefront of, shall we say, substantial challenges at the moment, start to look at that approach to deal with issues in their own country. My final point, as a lawyer, going back to that again, is this. From doing many criminal trials in relation to cybercrime, hacking, fraud, etc. One thing I've always found is that lawyers are a very conservative profession, doesn't matter whichever country you're in, and they're very insular. And I think the key thing going forward is when we combat cybercrime is that it must be seen that it has to be a joined up process. And one thing I would emphasize is that in any criminal case, whether it's warfare, espionage, fraud, or crime, that it is key, in my view, to have a very good, strong relationship with cyber professionals who can provide the backbone support to allow you, first of all, to understand the case against individuals, but also, secondly, to make the court or the judge understand the case that they are dealing with. And that's closing on a very practical note, bearing in mind we've talked about a lot of theoretical issues and a lot of highbrow stuff. But hopefully you can see that although we've talked about these matters to some extent, and quite an academic level, I hope you've seen how we've managed to bring it back into the reality and the practical situations that everybody faces in Europe at the present moment in time and elsewhere. And I think that really probably concludes the comments which we have for you today. Can I thank you for having us, first of all, and thank you for Mark and Steve for giving up their time to give a very fascinating and intellectually interesting, I hope you found it anyway, discussion about cyber warfare, and all the very best. And that's the end of the cyber warfare lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, dear colleagues. And I've got one question.
Oh, sorry.
If you can allow me. Yeah, we're talking about international framework. What do you think? Do we need a specialized international court for these kind of cases? Yeah. Is it possible? Is it real? Do you believe that it could be in nearest future?
I do agree. I agree with you. I think we do need a specialist international court. Is it possible? Probably 3 years ago or 5 years ago, no. But tragically, in light of the events which have happened to the Ukraine, and also events in the US and the Eastern Seaboard, even in Ireland, with the health system taken down for a week or so, there is a growing realization that cyber influences every aspect of our life. And when, in effect, you've got people using it for malignant purposes, whether it's nation states or hackers or criminals, then in my view, they need a deterrence. And the only deterrence we can give them at the moment is to try to push for an international cyber criminal court. That's my own view. But I think we need something to, in effect, be part of the international law norms regulating this type of activity. I don't know if we've got the time to just ask Steve and Mark for their views on that or not.
Steve, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, so I mean, if we do have time to, I would echo that basically. I mean, I think it is something that we're going to see the increasing relevance of, and that key word of specialist, i.e. in a position to understand the implications of it and the ability to discuss it and deal with it in an informed way is going to be key to taking that sort of thing forward.
Oh, absolutely. And I would just echo everything that's been said and say there is precedent for this, right? We're lawyers, we love precedent. In the American founding, you had separate courts of admiralty. Admiralty courts used to be separate. We used to have separate courts of law and courts of equity. And at least in the United States, those have merged. And in the United States, again, in the 1980s, we set up a special circuit court of appeals for issues dealing with patent litigation because it was so specialist and complex. So I think it's only logical that, a lot of senior judges and justices in the United States, for instance, are older. because in order to get to that level, you must have been practicing for a certain period of time. I can tell you that as of 10 years ago, not all of the US Supreme Court justices used email. So we can't expect people at the highest levels of the judicial system, many of whom have been practicing for a long time, to be up on top of the latest technological changes. And so they try to analogize back to areas of law that they're familiar with. And some of this stuff is terra incognita. It's unknown territory. So I think that a specialist court with experts not only in law, but cyber makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your participation, Will, for a very interesting material that you shared with us. I hope that we will use it in our cyber warfare against a lot of hackers that unfortunately came to our territory. It's battlefield not only in real life, it's battlefield on our cyber space, and we need to defend it. And thank you for the help of all countries that give us special programs to identify the hackers' attacks, to prevent them, to protect our energy, critical infrastructure, other organization, and all parts of our life that is in this space. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.